Hey, Dr. Paige here. Just wanted to pop on and talk about my favorite topic, which is how trauma impacts our performance. And it impacts it in a negative way, of course. So, when we really talk about trauma and what constitutes trauma, we talk about mental and physical trauma being the same, right? So it's Dr. Robert Scar's work, and he found that the brain and body goes into like a shock, no matter if it's mental or physical trauma. So no matter if you're getting a sports concussion, torn ACL, or if you go through a breakup, right? Or if you had to move clubs, or if you got traded, or a parent passed away, heaven forbid, an animal passed away, parents getting divorced, parents who didn't necessarily get along well and model great interpersonal relationship skills to you, or were fighting a lot, all of those things would be constituted as trauma. So mental or physical. And then another aspect of the physical trauma is when we put ourselves through a lot of stress too, like overtraining, not getting enough sleep. If we're not getting less than 8 hours to sleep a night, really our body's kind of inflamed, and it's really difficult for us to carry out our daily tasks, and even more difficult for us to make gains when we're training or scrimmaging or whatever that looks like. So when we're talking about trauma in the nervous system, we start looking at the fact that we have two ends of our nervous system. And so we have the sympathetic nervous system state. That's going to be our shock trauma response. We've got trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so when we're talking about sports performance out there and we're in a trauma response of sympathetic nervous system state, high beta brain wave or anxious beta is what that brain wave is. We look at the athletes saying like, oh my gosh, I'm overthinking it. I'm in my head, right? So if you're out there and you're trying to be in flow state and perform, which flow state is alpha brainwave, and we're having to overthink it and forcing our body to throw the ball, forcing ourselves to go through the motions, having to overthink things that we should be able to do in our sleep or in that no mind flow state zone. So that is going to be the fight trauma response. When you start looking at the freeze trauma response, if we're stuck in that from too much trauma and we say our trauma reservoir is full or we're maxed out, pinged out, our nervous system's hot, that's where we start to get into the bulking, blocks, yips, twisties, any of these things where we're literally losing control or unable to throw the ball, unable to throw the trick, unable to do any skill that we would have normally been able to do that we gained when we were much younger or even more recent. I've seen yips and some of those things occur in all sorts of different sports and environments and for different reasons or different traumas or different things that you went through environmentally within, family systems or coaches retiring or mean coaches or any of those things or teammates completing suicide. Lots of those things can actually create these trauma responses in us. And so the freeze, again, is going to be able to just kind of shutting down and not being able to get the body to do what it needs to do. Hesitating, like when we're making shots and stuff, the hesitation is a frozen response. When you're out batting in softball or baseball and you go to swing the bat and you're like, well, I moved, but your body doesn't move and do the full swing. Same thing with golf. So that'd be more that frozen response. And again, not an alpha brainwave flow state where we need to be, where our subconscious programming is, and where we should be able to do these things in our sleep because they're practiced neuromuscular patterns and skills. Another trauma response would be flight. So when we're out there and our legs are just shaking and we feel like we want to leave and we have like a panic attack or hyperventilating and the body's just like, I don't want to be here. This is too much for me. And you start to get that cognitive anxiety going and that body arousal, body shaking. That's going to be a pretty big flight response. And then when we talk about fawning, that's actually something that we're conditioned into doing as high performers. And that's appeasing, pleasing our coaches and spectators and our team and other people invested, like parents, coaches, all of our support system. So you see it often, even at a very high level, when it doesn't really need to be there anymore, when it comes to you have had proved yourself and are on the team and doing really well at a national level, but just always being hyper vigilant and aware of the coach's reaction or response to our performance. So was it a good play? Well, let's look at the coach and see if the coach is pissed, right? So we kind of learn how to fawn as well. And with the frozen, and we call it in the therapy world, disassociation or disconnection, we also learn through pain, right? The lactate threshold. So no pain, no gain kind of thing. When it comes to conditioning and gains, we learn how to kind of disassociate and disconnect as well. And so these are learned responses for high performers and what creates that resilience in our ability to play, right? And perform or compete or whatever we want to call it. But over time, if we're staying in these trauma responses and our nervous system's always sympathetic dominant, that means we are producing more cortisol. We're not sleeping fully. We're not dropping further down into delta brainwave. So we got beta high anxious, alpha flow state. That's where we want to be, the intuitive, where our body can recover and repair. Then we have our theta, where we're rest and recovery, almost asleep, and then down that delta, where we're actually making dreams, right? Well, if you're not dreaming, we know your nervous system's pretty hot. We know you're kind of stuck in one of these trauma responses. And it's super common to be in a trauma response, right? So it's like over the last 12 years of doing this work on high performers, athletes, individuals who have really done exceptional things, I find that that trauma response kind of helps you in the beginning, right? So it's that motivation. It's like, okay, I don't need 5 hours or more than 8 hours of sleep a night. I can run on 5 hours. And overachieving, taking 20 college credits on top of being a college athlete. Or I've known athletes in the NFL even that are playing and going to school in the summers, or expanding to a graduate level. I mean, just really exceptional things. However, over time, when we're constantly producing cortisol, constantly staying in a trauma state, trauma response, trauma reactions, producing too much cortisol, taxing those adrenals, which produce that cortisol. So our amygdala tells us to produce it based off of our current reality and what we're perceiving, is if we need to be in one of these aware trauma response fighting responses. We start to get adrenal fatigue. We start to get chronic fatigue. We start to lose motivation. We start to get tired. We hear this burnt out. 70% of entrepreneurs report being burnt out. And that's why, because we're up in this trauma response. We're pushing it. It's always the pedal to the metal kind of mentality, which is what creates a really high performing individual. However, it's not sustainable. And we actually know now, and even when we look at things like prescription medications like Adderall, that the focus component, people perceive themselves as getting more done and more focused when they actually are not. They're performing the same. And so we start to kind of look at that when we're in these trauma responses, and people think, oh, well, I'm high performing because I'm always going and I'm always on the go. And it's like, yeah, but actually you can get just as much done without being in this high cortisol, high beta, because you're not focusing as well either, but you're not recovering, you're not repair. And then we start looking at things like when we're stuck in trauma responses, it's one of my kind of favorite things to ask my high level athletes and high performers, entrepreneurs is, are you happy? And they'll just look at me like, well, I'm successful and I've got this going. It's like, yeah, but are you happy? Because truly being happy, you will never be able to be happy if you're in these trauma responses all the time, because it's cortisol. Where it's not the feel-good endorphins. It's not, there's no relaxation, there's no fun. And so we start to kind of become like, these robots, essentially going out there, playing well enough, and then having this kind of flat effect all the time. Nothing really makes us happy. Nothing really makes us sad. We're just there. We're just doing what we're supposed to be doing. We're in the sport. We're good at the sport. We're doing good enough. It's that kind of mental state you start to get into. And then when we start to get even further stuck in these trauma responses, then we start to get the mental health symptoms of that dropping from flat affect down to depressed, down to even suicide ideation, just feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm in this rat race and I can't get out. I don't find any joy in this anymore. I'm tired of this. You'll see this a lot with the athletes that have to travel a lot, which most do. But when we're really looking at like baseball players and hockey players, they have so many games that are consecutive to where they're on airplanes, which an airplane also pops us into a trauma response or sympathetic nervous system state. So if you're already in these trauma responses from being a high performer, going through the adversities you have, pushing your brain and your body, you're actually not recovering and it's making it worse. So we start to see things like sports concussions and neuroinflammation and individuals not really recovering from the concussions. We should really recover from a concussion within 1 to 3 weeks, but a lot of times these athletes don't have time in between games and then getting on the airplane. They'll be like inflaming foods and stuff that we're eating. You know, of course, we've all heard like, oh yeah, wheat and dairy and sugar is not good, and chemicals and all that stuff is not good either for our brains and for keeping us out of these trauma responses. And that would be something that would be an environmental trauma, right? So we've got emotional, we've got physical, of actually getting hurt, pushing it hard, hyperextending, joints and all those things. And then we have environmental stuff where we start looking at like drugs and alcohol and certain foods and having to fly, not getting enough sleep, inclement weather. I mean, it's never a good thing when you have to get out there and play in a snowstorm as a football player. So in hockey, they're indoors, but lacrosse and some of those sports where, in of course, American football, soccer, all these sports that have that weather component, that can be another thing that's really hard on the nervous system. And it could be push you that last, straw that breaks the camel's back from being able to pitch amazing to then start to develop some symptoms of the yips. And so I think oftentimes we look at our performance as we get older, that we like plateau or something, right? We think like, oh, well, in high school, this is the best I'm ever going to play. I'll be able to play D2, whatever that looks like. But when we actually look at things from a nervous system perspective, by the time you're in high school, your trauma reservoir is full, or you've had a lot of negative experiences by then. You've just lived life. And we need to then implement the Alpha Imprinting, where we drop you into the altered states. You don't have to use psilocybin or any of these psychoactive things. We can do it with sounds. And then we simply go back through all of the negative experiences and traumas, environmental, mental, or physical, to reprocess and desensitize them and discharge the shock from the nervous system. And so that actually has us reset our nervous system so that we stay more in that alpha flow state all the time. And so that's more parasympathetic dominance. We want parasympathetic dominance. We want our nervous system to be able to go out there, do a play hard, or do a run if we're a skier, runner, whatever, do your trick, and then come back, and we want your nervous system to come back down. We don't want to stay in that high beta wave sympathetic nervous system dominance. We want to be able to come all the way back down and to that parasympathetic to rest before our next run or our next inning or whatever that looks like. So when we're looking at the number one thing that will inhibit an athlete's performance, their ability to continue to make gains, their ability to maintain, their ability to make the next level, and even their ability to really enhance their skills, it all has to do with nervous system states and what they've experienced. And the unfortunate thing with things as well is that everyone we're around, we're syncing to. Energy begets energy. So this is our quantum physics perspective and principle. But every time we're around someone, our nervous system is trying to align with theirs and sync with theirs. And so we call it coherence, co-regulation. And so even being around your anxious players on your team, or parents or coaches or anyone else who's anxious or dysregulated, as we'd say, or is in high beta wave, they're negatively impacting us. So another aspect of doing the work of keeping your nervous system optimized is to reprocess some of your teammate stuff or negative things you've seen happen to opponents or teammates, and now in this day and age with YouTube and so on, I mean, I'm old, so it's like back in the day, like we weren't watching reels of ski crashes or anything when we were skiing. It was more that like, hey, we knew these things could happen. But nowadays it's like, yeah, if you've seen these crash reels, if you've seen these other football players completely blow their ACL on a seemingly harmless play, all that kind of stuff, we know that can potentially happen. So it actually alarms our nervous system. It's this mirrored neuron aspect along with that frequency component. We call it secondary or vicarious trauma. And so we lay down memory networks worried that that is going to happen to us. And it's really outside of our conscious awareness. And so that's why when we talk about your subconscious programming, by the time you're 25, your actions, reactions, and who you are is already programmed within your nervous system, within your neural pathways. And so really by 25, you're a high level athlete. You want no maladaptation in there. You want no dysregulation, right? So because then when you're out there in the alpha brainwave, which is subconscious, we want you to be able to be playing without any hesitation, without any trauma response, without any of this subconscious, oh no, this bad thing could happen again. Because I've seen it happen to another player, or because it's happened before, or because I was criticized for this thing. So that's why it's so important when we're doing this nervous system resetting work to be in the subconscious. So the unconscious, the conscious, I'm in my conscious state of mind right now. I'm literally telling you information. I'm consciously aware. But subconscious is when we're out there playing. And it's also one of the biggest subconscious things that I tell people, like, yeah, you know, like when you're driving a car, you are subconsciously driving a car. No one is consciously aware at how they're feathering their foot on the battery, gas pedal, whatever you want to call it. We only come back to conscious awareness when we see a red light or see a red sign, or see something abnormal than what we are used to within that subconscious programming of driving down the highway or driving down the street. So it's the same thing with our sports performance. We want to be in subconscious flow state where we are just automatically tuned into everyone else around us in a subconscious way, with that programming of knowing exactly when the pitcher does a certain motion, it's going to be a curveball and you're going to be ready to hit it. So this is why we work within the subconscious. So we put on the sounds, we go back through all the negative things that have ever occurred. It's always surprising to clients and my high performers, because we're not ones that like to kind of sit there and make a list about the shitty things that have happened to us or the things that we've been through that we didn't like. But when we're in that subconscious state, we actually find things or remember things that we completely forgot about. That could be like the missing link when it comes to why we're in that fight state when we're out there batting and overthinking or something, right? And so once we clear those things and reset that nervous system, we are less sympathetic dominant, more parasympathetic. We're staying in the alpha flow, and then we're able to subconsciously play and use those fine-tuned motor skills that we've been accumulating since we were like 4 years old. So the number one thing that inhibits an athlete's sports performance are the environmental, mental, and physical traumas. And all we have to do is get back into the subconscious, reprocess, desensitize, and reset that nervous system state. And what I've seen over the last 10 years doing QEEG brain scans, so pre and post with athletes and high performers and veterans and all of these amazing individuals that have done things that I can't even fathom physically or mentally, is that our pre-measurement, we do this QEEG that measures reaction time, right? So basically we put this basket of electrodes on your head, and we have you shut your eyes, and it's a test that you'll hear a low-pitched ding in your ear, and then you'll hear a high-pitched ding in your ear. And so every time you hear the high-pitched ding, we have you click the mouse. And so what that shows us then is when we look at the scan, how fast did it take each area of the brain of the 19 electrodes, so the 19 areas of the brain, to recruit and respond? Because we know when we go through trauma that it decreases or it increases our reaction time, right? So what we see is that after we do the 10 sessions of the Alpha Imprinting, that we actually have an enhanced reaction time and we're reacting quicker. And so each area, it's called the P300, meaning 300 milliseconds. So how fast you hear that ding and then click. Well, the majority of individuals, we will see them at 300 or above. So it's taking them longer than 300 milliseconds. And then after we do the Alpha Imprinting, we see that it's below 250 typically, which that's a lot of time if you think about it. So when we think about the decision to hit a ball or not, or hesitate when we're batting, because we have this slight hesitation because the body's still holding on, it's in this taut state, it's in this retracted state, the sympathetic nervous system state. It's like that can be the difference between hitting a home run and hitting a foul ball. So thinking about it in that way. And so that's one thing that we see. The other thing that we see is we see that the brain stays more in alpha brainwave. So the beta theta ratio, so the two ends of the nervous system, the brain waves, beta, again, sympathetic, anxious, trauma response, theta, rest and recovery, parasympathetic, we see the beta theta ratio get smaller. And so that means that you are actually staying in alpha brainwave or flow state all the time. And so that's exactly where we want to be as athletes. We want to be in flow state. We want to have enhanced reaction time. And so we know this about trauma. You can't make this stuff up. These are real data from QEEG brain scans, looking at hundreds of athletes' brains, and you can even know for yourself. So I just opened another in-person office here in Woodland Hills, California. And if you're interested in coming in and having your brain scanned and doing the 10 sessions and then scanning again to show the gains that you've made, you can absolutely do that. But I just want athletes to be aware and not be, I guess, afraid. You know, I practiced 12 years ago with this knowledge and understanding of the physiology of sports psychology and the trauma response and what was happening to the body when it went through trauma. And a lot of my background was really in emergency medicine and wilderness first responder and EMT work. And it was really, really interesting to me to learn how everyone's body responds differently to trauma too. Some people will cry, some people will be in pain, some people will completely disassociate and disconnect from their leg being, you know, halfway chopped off by a semi accident or something of that nature. Some people laugh, some people vomit, which is very common because the body's just like, I can't handle digesting anything right now. This isn't going to work. We need to put all of our energy and attention to whatever is hurt. And that's why, like with a concussion, it will immediately, the brain's like, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. And a lot of times people throw up from having a concussion and can be one of your indicators that you have a concussion, even if your head's not hurting. But yeah, so really understanding that our nervous system is a little more fragile than we'd like to know in some respects. And that when we have that shock on it, our duromotor sheath around our brain and our spine actually tightens. And so it pulls us into this retracted position. Is Dr. Bruce Davis's work around, he was a craniopath and would show the range of motion when he was working with athletes. He's up in Seattle and I worked with him for years, and understanding that when we had an individual bring up the thought of the sports injury or the thought of the car accident or the thought of the parent passing away or something, that we actually had a decreased range of motion when he would move the neck. And so it was quite fascinating. And then we would have the individual come into my office and we would have them work through that trauma, go through it. You're essentially just telling the story. It's really not that you can't mess up in doing this work. And then would go back into his office and the range of motion would be restored. Then he was able to get an effective treatment, which he did cranial path and soft touch, craniosacral chiropractor kind of work. But really interesting stuff to learn that other layer of how the fascia network responds to trauma too. And that was really Dr. Peter Levine's work of Waking the Tiger in the psychology world. We all had to read that in grad school and so on, but talking about how the fascia does hold on to emotional experience and gets tight. And that's why oftentimes with athletes, when they come to me, they are physically healed, but they're still getting a pain signal and they're still have a decrease in range of motion. I'm like, oh yeah, well, that's just the trauma response. We got to release it in the midbrain, which is doing the work with the alpha imprinting. And I will say that this is the drugless way and the healthier way utilizing sounds. I'm not for psychedelic and some of the research within and around that, but I have found that by manipulating the visual path, covering one eye or the other and listening to the sounds, we can drop just as deeply into the altered state and find the memories and find the things that need to be accessed to be fully processed and released from that nervous system to allow for the amygdala to calm down and no longer be in this hypervigilant trauma response, all day, every day, essentially. But yeah, so some of your bigger indicators as an athlete right now is if you're overthinking things, you have that cognitive or physical anxiety, the body arousal or overthinking things, worried about things, not being able to sleep, not sleeping well, not being able to fall asleep, not staying asleep. All of those things are really indicators that you need a reset and that you're running on hot in that beta wave. And I think that the coolest thing and the feedback I've gotten over the years of working with so many different athletes, because I do pretty brief work with people. We do about 10-second sessions in consecutive weeks. And then it's kind of a needs basis or monthly tune-up kind of thing. So yeah, so it's not forever work. So you don't have to be afraid. We're not going to psychoanalyze you. Anyone who's trained in this technique, because I train others, and there are others in your area, even throughout the United States and world, that are trained in this. But it is that this is all about nervous system state work and getting you optimized brain and body so that you can continue to play the sport you love, prolong your career. If you're a weekend warrior and doing these things on the weekend, you can maintain your health longer, all that good stuff. But yeah, so the number one reason athletes' performance declines is from trauma. Plus, it makes you more susceptible to injury because if you're not as flexible, we all know that that's a huge disadvantage when you're out there playing. So just want to pop on again today as I talk about this a lot, but feel free to reach out to me with any other questions. You can find me on all socials at Sports Psych Paige. And yeah, have a great day.